Arizona hockey star Paul Bissonnette got into a tilly, this time off of the ice, recently in Scottsdale, Arizona. We're going to break down his defense of others today. Hello everyone, my name is attorney Rachel Moss, and like I said, today we're going to be breaking down the Paul Bissonnette video that has been going viral recently. If you're not familiar with Paul Bissonnette, he is an Arizona hockey star. He played for the Coyotes from 2009 to 2014. He appeared in about 187 games, and he was known as Biz Nasty. So today we're going to break down Biz Nasty's use of defense of others. So Paul Bissonnette was assaulted in Scottsdale by a group of men at a restaurant known as Houston's. Now we're going to dive in and watch this video together and then break down everyone's use of self-defense or defense of others. So first we're going to start inside the restaurant at Houston's. And here you can see there are some men drinking at the bar. There's a big group of men here and you can see them starting to get a little rowdy. One of the men in particular you can see approaching one of the employees at Houston's, starting to get aggressive. And then later you can see Paul coming up approaching this man. And you can see after this, these men start to swing at Paul. Now, Paul starts to run from the restaurant as well as some other families with their children trying to get away from this fight. And then we pick up here outside. So as you can see, Paul is the party backing up and these other men from inside the bar are approaching him. We can't hear exactly what's going on, but it seems like Paul is attempting to de-escalate. He's backing away, he's not raising his fists, he's not coming towards any of the men. The men are coming towards him here. Also, as a side note, it looks like Paul has taken off his shirt as well. And then he continues to back away from these men, and these men are chasing him down. There's a few other men as well that seem to just be observing, not involved in the fight itself. And again, here we can really see that Paul is not taking any sort of action. These men are the ones pursuing Paul. And then this is where you can see the fight really starting to escalate, where the men really start aggressively chasing Paul, and one of them knocks him to the ground. And three men really are all going at Paul at the same time, where a few of the other men are hanging back. Here you can see it's not limited to punches. Some of the men are even kicking Paul very aggressively, and Paul is using force just limited to his hands in order to deter. Now Paul is getting away, running away, and the men are still trying to pursue him, but it seems like they gave up here at the end. So there's a little bit to unpack here. The first thing to talk about is that initial confrontation in the bar, where that young man approaches that employee very aggressively. And here, again, it's one of those situations where when we can't hear what exactly is being said, it can be a little hard to make a full analysis of what's going on. Not all details have come out about this incident. It'll be very interesting to see what the police reports show and see what was actually said during this exchange. But what it looks like is that this man in this group of these drinking men was getting really aggressive with an employee. You can see him starting to move in the employee's face. It's unclear if a use of force was threatened, but you could see people around him getting uncomfortable. And it arises to the point where Paul himself has to get up and approach these men. So Paul gets up, and it's really important what he does next. He uses mere words. He doesn't go in and try to fight these men immediately. He's responding proportionally. He's talking to these men. And what he says next isn't necessarily the best statement for Paul, but I think we can see that the police and prosecutors aren't really too concerned with what Paul said.
I get up and I go over, I go, guys, if you keep harassing and assaulting these guys, I'm going to meet you in the parking lot. And as soon as I said that, they just all started swinging.
Paul can be quoted saying, "If you keep harassing and assaulting these guys, I'm going to meet you in the parking lot." So there can be an argument here that maybe Paul was threatening these guys. In Arizona, there is a crime for threatening and intimidating. However, you can only be charged with this crime if you're threatening bodily injury or death to someone else. And here, Paul isn't really threatening bodily injury or death. There's nothing specific he really says. By a stretch, you could argue meet me in the parking lot is basically translation for I might have to go out and fight you to shut down this bad behavior. However, I think Paul can reasonably say, and an attorney like me could reasonably argue, that Paul maybe wanted them to just step outside the restaurant and shut them down from just getting rowdy inside this restaurant. Maybe he just wanted to have a conversation with him. So I don't think Paul's behavior here was too alarming. I don't think he was out of line. He was just trying to shut down bad behavior. And his statement, while not perfect, does not rise to the level of a threat. So I think Paul was well within his rights here. And what immediately happened, Paul did not take any physical action towards these men. These men started attacking him inside the bar. So from this point, these men started aggressing towards Paul. An important part about self-defense or defense of others to keep in mind is that you cannot act based on verbal provocation alone, unless it's verbal provocation plus some sort of action that indicates that a force is imminent. So for example, if I was going to come up to you and say, I'm going to get you, and I'm kind of far away from you, there's no evidence I'm actually going to do anything, that's verbal provocation alone. But if you add something to that, maybe I'm raising my fist, maybe I'm walking towards you as I say it, that's verbal provocation plus something else, where you might be justified in using force against me. Again, insults are also never a reason to step in and use self-defense or defense of others. So even if someone says something pretty nasty to you, maybe they call you ugly, that's not enough to use force against that other person. There needs to be verbal provocation plus something else, or just a clear use of force in order to respond with force to protect yourself or someone else. And here we can see that these individuals responded to Paul's verbal actions with force. So Paul did not have a verbal provocation plus something else. There was no indication that these men were facing an imminent use of force from Paul. Paul said, meet me out in the parking lot. So even if you interpret Paul's words to mean the worst thing possible, saying he actually did want to go out to the parking lot and just brutally fight these guys, he said, if you continue, I'm going to have to do these things. So there was no imminent threat to these men. So they were not entitled to use self-defense or defense of others at this point, even if you interpret Paul's words to mean the worst thing possible. So here, these men responded with force when they were not justified in doing so. So these men were not justified in using any sort of force against Paul. They start swinging at Paul, and at this point, now Paul is the party being aggressed on. So if Paul wanted to act in defense of himself at this point, he is completely justified in doing so. And it's always important to keep in mind that self-defense or defense of others must be proportionate. So that means you respond with force in kind. So if someone comes at you with just their fist and there's someone that's not able of inflicting serious physical injury or death upon you with their fist, then you can't pull out a deadly weapon like a firearm. However, if they are someone that is capable of exercising serious physical injury or death against you, or if they're coming at you with a weapon, that's a time where something like a firearm would be proportionate. So here Paul, as he is being attacked, has to keep in mind that he must respond proportionately to this level of force. Here, the only type of force you see Paul use throughout the interaction, both inside the bar and outside of the bar, is ordinary physical force. He's responding just with his fist. And he even is making an effort to retreat doing this. However, even though Paul did not use deadly physical force in this video, I think there's the argument that he could have. He was facing a fight from multiple other individuals. And these guys were, probably smaller than him, maybe not as strong as him, but there were 3 guys coming at him at once. The 3 guys together were able to knock him to the ground and keep him there. So I think there was an argument that Paul could have used deadly physical force here as well. However, we don't really need to go into that because he didn't. It's just good to know that it was an option here. Once the fight moves outside, Paul continues to exercise only ordinary physical force in response to these other individuals. But I think another interesting thing to note is that Paul is actively retreating throughout this altercation. In Arizona, there is no duty to retreat. So Arizona is a stand your ground state. So here where Paul is acting in defense of himself, he does not actually have to retreat. But you can always choose that option even though he could just stand his ground. And here Paul chose to do that. And I think Paul did the analysis here that for him it might have been safer to try to avoid this fight than to stand his ground and engage in this fight. And every situation is going to be unique. And so even though you have the right to stand your ground, doesn't mean you necessarily have to do so. Here, Paul was trying to get away the whole time, and these men continued to follow him. And Paul did not have to wait for these men to actually reach him in order to strike back. That's what Paul ultimately did. He backed away, waited for these men to come to him. But when it's clear that these men are coming after him, raising their fists, trying to swing at him, Paul could have stopped and used ordinary physical force and come after them before they made it all the way to him. These men ultimately were able to knock Paul to the ground. Again, their use of force completely unjustified here. There is no evidence at any time that Paul exceeded the amount of force necessary to deter. He was using proper self-defense here, because there is an exception where aggressors are able to claim self-defense. One of the exceptions is if Paul was to act disproportionately to their amount of force. So for example, if Paul had pulled out a firearm, these individuals would have had an argument that they could then respond in self-defense. I still think it'd be hard for them to do that because I feel like I could argue here that pulling out a firearm using deadly physical force would be justified. However, if Paul had done that, that would have given these individuals an argument for self-defense. But in reality, that never happened. Paul only responded proportionately the entire time. He really was only using the amount of force necessary to block their attacks. He wasn't trying to beat these guys up. He was just trying to calm down the situation. Eventually, Paul gets up and is able to run away. The men continue to chase him for a little bit, and Paul eventually gets away and the altercation is over. So overall, I have to say I approve Biz Nasty's use of force here in this video. Paul did a great job. He was responding to an imminent threat. He was reacting proportionately, and he was reasonable. Reasonableness is something that we mention in every single legal analysis that we do because it's very important. Self-defense, defense of others also has to be reasonable. So throughout this video, you can see that Paul acted reasonably, and it's very likely that if he was to ever be charged, he would be found to act reasonably. I think here we can be pretty confident that Paul's not going to be charged with anything. It is very obvious in this video Paul was not the aggressor, he acted reasonably the entire time, and that these other individuals absolutely did not. And prosecutors, officers, already agree with this. I reviewed an indictment in this case. One of the individuals in the case, Sean Daly, has already been indicted for his activities in attacking Paul. Sean has been indicted by a grand jury for one count of aggravated assault. That is a Class 6 felony in Maricopa County, as well as one count disorderly conduct, which is a Class 1 misdemeanor. So it's interesting here, the type of aggravated assault he is charged with is a Class 6 felony. Class 6 felonies are the lowest type of felony in Arizona. That means while he could be facing some prison time or probation time here, it's the lowest type that he could be facing in the state. On the flip side, he's charged with the most serious type of misdemeanor, a Class 1 misdemeanor. So here he could be facing up to 6 months in jail for that misdemeanor charge. There are many types of aggravated assault. The type that Sean was charged with here is for attacking Paul while his capacity to resist was substantially impaired. This is important because basically what this means is that Paul was in a situation where he was kind of unable to defend himself. Here, his capacity to resist that force was impaired by the fact that he was being attacked by multiple people. So the most common way I see this charged is when either one person is holding someone down while the other person is attacking, Or the other way I see it is when there are multiple attackers just straight up attacking one person. And I think we might have seen a combination of both in this case. It seems like at some point, some people were holding down Paul, and at others, there were just multiple people attacking him. So here we're gonna see Sean Daly being charged, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens next in this case. The 3 other individuals were referred to the Scottsdale City Prosecutor's Office for charges. So the Scottsdale City Prosecutor's Office had a chance to review, dismiss this, and said these need to be considered for felony charges. So we're going to see that next. We don't know if the Maricopa County Attorney's Office is going to move forward with charges for these other individuals, but it's definitely possible that a complaint could be filed or they could be indicted by a grand jury, just like Sean was already. Additionally, a little more drama has come out of this case because when this video was published online, a few days earlier, a young man named Carter, who worked at the Ravens Golf Club in Phoenix, was involved in an altercation with what he believes is this same group of men. And in this altercation, it looks like one of these men that was in the Paul Bissonnette altercation basically came after Carter out of nowhere and just started punching him in the side of the head. Carter said this happened after these men refused to leave the golf club when it was closing time. So we're starting to get an idea that this is a very rowdy group of young men that have been in a number of altercations over a couple days. So these men are being referred to for charges as well for this incident involving Carter. So we're probably going to see these men being prosecuted over the months to come. It'll be very interesting to see how these cases shake out. It looks like it's going to be a combination of misdemeanor and felony charges here. So once again, I think Paul's use of force was excellent in this case. I guess he learned a thing or two from being a hockey player, getting in some fights on the ice. Thank you for tuning in to another legal analysis. If you want to learn more about our law firm, you can check us out on attorneysforfreedom.com, get to know our team, and learn a little bit about the types of cases we take. You can also check us out on attorneysonretainer.us. Attorneys on Retainer is a self-defense protection program where if you find yourself in a self-defense incident, we could cover your legal fees. So learn all about the program at attorneysonretainer.us. And while you're here, go ahead, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Check out some of our other videos as well. Thank you again for tuning in. Peace.